Have you ever wondered who Whiterun's backup innkeeper is? No, seriously. Have you ever done so before reading the title of this video? Because I can promise you, it's not as straightforward of a question as you think. I mean, if you can answer this question without hesitating, you're either a liar, someone who's misremembering something, an AI, or an ex-Bethesda employee who worked on the game. But for all intents and purposes, let me just assume you weren't able to answer the question without doubting yourself. That's good, because I sure as sure couldn't tell you. If I could directly talk to the game, even it wouldn't be able to tell me. And that's exactly because there seemingly never was a consensus made about said question. Who is the backup innkeeper? In a way, no one is. Well, at some point, multiple people were meant to be. But then all of them ended up used for other purposes in the final game, resulting in a deeply confusing mess. So why not go and try finding out the answer for ourselves? I'm UnknownG, and today we're gonna be looking at Whiterun's backup innkeeper. So first things first, the very basics. In Skyrim, a backup innkeeper is usually the person who's closest to the initial innkeeper, like a husband or wife, or an employee of them. Seeing as basically every city only has one tavern, this pattern never really deviates. One notable exception to this is Markarth, where the inn is owned by an entire family. If the innkeeper Clapper dies, his wife Frabby will take over. If she dies, then their son Ryan will take over. If he dies, then his sister Roki takes over. And if they're all dead, then Riada from the Treasury House takes over, for some reason. But that pattern makes sense for the most part. In Whiterun, that's not really the case. So who are our possible options there? Well, when starting the game, Ysolda is the innkeeper, so she's out. But we actually have 4 different suspects, all with wildly differing validity to their claims. Number 1 is Mikael, the bard who works for Ysolda. Number 2 is Olfina Greymane, a local girl who occasionally works at the inn. Number 3 is Saadia, the serving girl who also works for Ysolda. And number 4 is Ysolda, another local girl who, well, we'll get into that. I suppose it's easiest to start with the weakest claim, and that's Saadia's. Saadia is a potential member of the Job Innkeeper faction, which means she can become a member if the actual innkeeper dies. She also holds that same potential status in the Job Rent Room faction, and in the unused quest supply line, the backup innkeeper dialogue was assigned to Saadia. But that's all there is for her. Everyone in favor of taking her out of the running? Good. The next claim belongs to Olfina Greymane. While Olfina doesn't have any of the relevant factions like Saadia does, she has a lot more weird quirks. For example, her class is set to food vendor like the average innkeeper, and she actually has the required scripts attached to rent out beds at the Bannered Mare. But most interestingly, both her boyfriend John Battleborn and owner of the Drunken Huntsman Elrindir will refer to Olfina as the new innkeeper of the Bannered Mare if Ysolda is dead. While you can see that the game is already getting confused, I'm ready to smack this claim down, as Olfina's possible role as housecarl invalidates her role as an innkeeper. Though it should be noted that her brother Evelstein has some internal leftovers showing that he was at one point meant to be the housecarl instead. Our next claim, and I'll spoil this already, what appears to be our most valid claim, comes from the bard Mikael. Now, being the bard at the establishment, Mikael already has ties to the place, but unlike the 2 previously mentioned, Mikael has something a lot more important, and that's the dialogue for the rumors Ysolda usually gives out. This, at the very least, shows that Mikael was thought of when backups for these rumors were made. Besides this, he is also a potential member of the 3 required factions, just like Saadia was. However, unlike Olfina, there is no dialogue for other NPCs that mention Mikael running the inn, and Mikael also does not possess the required script to rent out beds. So make of that what you wish. And now finally, we get to Ysolda. Now, Ysolda is special to me, but not for the reason you might be thinking of. No, on the contrary, Ysolda to me will always be known as the Whiterunner waifu. Whiterunner in this context being a derogatory term I've always used for the people that claim they love Skyrim and its world, but can only name Jarl Balgruuf, Nazim, and a handful of other NPCs from Whiterun, just because that's the first city the game sent you to, and they never bother to enrich themselves in the lore of other characters of the other cities. I mean, If the companions weren't headquartered in Whiterun, no one would even know or care about that wet wipe of affection. But let's put that tangent aside for a moment. While a lot of people cherish Ysolda for being one of the first marriageable NPCs you can come across, with an easy quest requirement and not being abnormal looking by Bethesda standards, I remember Ysolda for just how inconsistent she is. That inconsistency is tied into the innkeeper question, but it doesn't even stop there. So I'll be tackling it all in just a moment. Still, we're first gonna be looking at exactly how logical it is for Ysolda to become the backup innkeeper. I mean, if you were just going off dialogue, it would be the most logical thing ever. Well, at least at first glance. One of the first things you might get to know about Ysolda is that she plans to buy an inn someday. Hulda herself also mentions that she has plans to sell the inn to Ysolda. But that's it actually. There's no other dialogue that refers to Ysolda wanting to run the bannered mare. Strange, right? It's like we've all been conditioned to believe such an obviously incorrect statement for all these years. Is there even any other reference that ties Ysolda to the inn? Well, yes, there is actually. Just one. The dialogue Whiterun quest contains aliases for important people in town, such as the Jarl or the blacksmith, but also the local innkeeper and their backup. In this case, the innkeeper is marked as Hulda, while the backup is marked as Ysolda. Now, that's very strange. Why? Well, as in the same list of aliases, Ysolda is also marked as the backup of the general trader Bellator. Now yes, Ysolda makes absolutely zero reference to the fact that she would take over Bellator's shop, or that she even associates with him, but she is actually a part of his shop faction from the very start. Meanwhile, she isn't part of any of the inn factions, nor does she have the required script to rent out beds. I mean, unlike the others, she isn't even linked to Hulda by relationship markers. There's just nothing going on here. Ysolda wasn't originally designed as the backup innkeeper, that much we know. But she also wasn't made to be the backup general merchant either. Then, what was she? Well, that question can actually be answered quite easily by asking yourself about something you've probably also overlooked for years. In the drunken quest for Sanguine, why in the world did we purchase a ring from Ysolda? Where would she even get it? Oh, scratch that, she didn't get it, she apparently made it. What I'm trying to say here is that it seems super duper likely that Ysolda was at one point the jewelry vendor at Whiterun's marketplace. And there are a lot of traces left over of this. For example, Ysolda herself says she spends a lot of time trading with the Khajiit caravans. But what would she even trade? The dialogue in her quest and even her greetings imply she already is a trader. So exactly what does she trade? That question never gets answered. Her whole ties to the Khajiit caravans are also very murky, as she's set up as friends with Madran. But his caravan doesn't normally visit Whiterun. A normally inconsequential note found near the city also mentions Akari, another caravan leader of a caravan that also doesn't stop in Whiterun, having set up an apparent skooma trade with Olava the Feeble. That's also something that never gets addressed, but the important takeaway here is that at no point does Rhysald ever gets mentioned, despite him, being the caravan head honcho and actually stopping outside the city. Now sure, you may explain this away as a mere writing inconsistency, gods know those happen, but if there's anything I've learned is that these mistakes don't just happen. And if there's not yet enough evidence for you, then take a look at a note found on the corpse of Ysolda's drug smuggler friend Hulag, which asks him to bring the found items to her stall. Which stall? The one a marketplace vendor might use? That's pretty damning already, but there is one more piece of evidence which I truly consider the smoking gun. In case you didn't know, sometimes you can view earlier iterations of dialogue in the creation kit, and before you ask, no, that dialogue usually doesn't overlap with the versions found in the dialogue views. I know, I have no clue why either. Earlier lines for Ysolda seen with Carlotta though, have her directly refer to herself as another merchant, not just a trader. And placed in this context, wouldn't it make sense to view it as a fellow market vendor? Like so many of the other cases I've covered on this channel, this is just all so strange to me. The way this is also interwoven in the game data. I mean, I haven't even mentioned that the official game guide tries to gaslight you into believing that Ysolda just happens to make handcrafted goods she sells to the Khajiit. Handcrafted goods such as rings and jewelry maybe? No really, what's going on here? I also haven't mentioned how Amran's wife Saphir is internally marked as a pawnbroker and is in both the merchant and marketplace vendor factions. Oh, and Sigurd, the guy who actually appears to be Bellator's most logical backup at first glance, seems to have originally been a servant at Dragon's Reach. Like, what? Just how many roles were switched up here? Am I gonna need a Ubisoft DLC roadmap to understand Bethesda's weird design decisions here? How would you even fix this? I suppose that Saadia can be left alone. She is the serving girl and she can disappear completely due to her quest. She should have never even been considered for the role. Then there's Mikael. While he seems to be a good fit, nothing about him screams tavern owner. I personally wouldn't have given him the role, and doing so seems to have been an afterthought by Bethesda either way. Normally the bard never takes over the inn, unless they're also the server like Karita in Dawnstar for example. I honestly feel like the best fit would be Olfina Greymane. It seems that she actually was up for the job, up until someone decided that Evelstein couldn't serve as Stormcloak housecarl due to him also disappearing because of a quest. Sure, Olfina talks about being a strong Nord and such, but her standing there as a housecarl in her barkeep clothes with a dagger is just pretty stupid. And then there's Ysolda. What to do with her? Well, first off, I wouldn't make her Bellator's backup. I would use Sigurd for that. But then we have all these other ties to Ysolda being a merchant. I find it hard to say that she could just replace Fralia Greymane as jewelry merchant, as Fralia seems to have been actually written with this role in mind. Mostly at least. A whole lot more than the others I've mentioned in this video so far. I don't know. Maybe it would have made more sense for Ysolda to kinda be an apprentice to Fralia? That could work. I mean, Fralia and Jorland are getting up there in years, and Ysolda is still young, willing to learn, and apparently makes her own jewelry. It could be written in a way that Fralia is showing her the ropes. But alas, that's not what we got in the final game. What we have there is nothing more than a tangled mess of leftover ideas, concepts and iterations interwoven. I don't know if you've heard about that whole Bethesda doesn't use design documents when making games debacle, but when you show me stuff like this, I'm pretty inclined to believe you. Oversights like this just seem preventable. But I guess someone had to make a couple of hasty replacements, and that's why we ended up with such a messy result. Oh well, I'm sure Bethesda didn't mess up like this with another marketplace vendor. And that's one more end of my chest. I hope you learned something, and I hope that I can maybe one day unlearn all this stuff. Or maybe have the team at Bethesda craft a remade Skyrim which incorporates the original vision. Wouldn't that be something? Oh, what's that? I never actually answered who Whiterun's backup innkeeper is. Well, that's because there is no backup innkeeper. Fun stuff, right? Ysolda actually takes over the inn upon Hulda's death, but she isn't in any of the factions and can't offer you any of the related dialogue for services. So you're now effectively left with a broken innkeeper. Great. I've been an ONG. Cheers.